This is Michele for WVIP, and I'm here today with Tom Cowan. He is a practitioner of core shamanism, and he holds a doctorate in history and the humanities. He has written a book called Fire in the Head, Shamanism and the Celtic Spirit. Okay, I think what we better talk about first here is, could we define the nature of shamanism and what that is exactly?
Sure. Shamanism is a system of healing based on spiritual practices that originated in tribal cultures 40,000 years ago, back in hunting-gathering societies. And basically the shaman is a healer and a spiritual leader who has powers or knowledge and wisdom because of working with helping spirits. And until 25, 30 years ago, most shamans were tribal people. And beginning around the 1960s and 70s, people like Michael Harner and others who discovered shamanism as anthropologists began experimenting with whether or not people like us living in Western culture could practice the same kind of spiritual techniques and healing techniques that tribal people have done for thousands of years. And the results are really spectacular in the sense that, yes, shamanism seems to be a basically human activity satisfying very human needs. And so there's a form of shamanism called core shamanism, which is basically consists of the core practices that you find among shamans all over the world. And it's remarkable how people like ourselves can learn them and adapt them and use them in our own spiritual practice and in our own healing work.
Could you give me an example of what a core practice might be?
Sure. One of the basic practices that shamans engage in all over the world is a method of shifting their conscious awareness, shifting their consciousness so that they can perceive the spirit world and the spirits, realities that are normally imperceptible to people that are not in that state of consciousness. And techniques for doing that vary around the world. Many places use psychoactive substances, herbs, and what we would call drugs.
Right.
But another widespread method of doing it is by drumming and rattling, dancing.
What about this idea of going into a cave or into a sweat lodge or that kind of thing?
Right. Another core technique is to have some kind of sensory deprivation, being in a dark place or a place cut off from sounds and noises. Typically when people practice shamanism and journey into the spirit world, they'll do it in a darkened room, or they'll put a bandana over their eyes or a hood to sort of block out this reality, because the point here is to let your inner senses be able to move into other realities.
Is this why perhaps the earliest paintings that we know of are in caves?
Could be.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the kind of paintings that you see there are, of course people disagree on how to interpret them, but one interpretation is that they are basically pictures of shamans and animals and the spirits of animals, the energy, the power of the natural world.
Because they tend to look like men and have animal heads.
Yes,
that kind of thing, yeah.
Right,
yeah.
Because another core practice or core element of shamanism is to have some helping spirits in the form of animals. Since animals have been on the planet longer than humans and know things and do things in a natural, spontaneous way, we've always looked at animals as having a kind of inner wisdom and knowing secrets about nature and the universe that we can learn from. So it's very common among shamans and shamanic practitioners to have among their helping spirits some animal spirits.
What's the difference between core and tribal shamanism?
Well, tribal shamanism would be core shamanism practiced in various cultural ways. So, for example, if you see what the Aborigines in Australia are doing, it would have an Australian Aborigine flavor to it. If you look at shamans in Siberia, they would be practicing in a Siberian way. If you look in Africa, the different tribal people, you'd see, cultural trappings to their ceremonies, their rituals, their songs, the spirits that they use. But the core elements, as I mentioned, are pretty much universal. So that even though there are different culturally specific things, there are also practices that you can kind of extract from those tribal settings and practice in a different way, a new way.
Yeah. Well, I think we should, in as much as the book is about Celtic, we ought to get to the Celtic Isles and talk about that a little bit, or what we perceive to be. I mean, I know that the Celts were everywhere, but we tend to think of them as being more
in the British Isles.
In the British Isles. So, what about this idea of Arthur and the merge between Christianity, the Celtic thoughts, and is there some particular theme around the stories of the Knights of the Round Table and how that blended the two concepts of Christianity and Celtic shamanism?
Well, Celtic shamanism, let's just kind of start there for a moment, because it's not just Arthur and the Round Table, but it's basically, again, these techniques of journeying into the spirit world, or what in the Celtic lands is often called the fairy world, or the fairy realms, and using those techniques to bring back knowledge or information or spiritual power for yourself or others. And if you want to look specifically, say, at the Arthurian stories, particularly the stories about the Grail, you have a very similar theme of somehow the Grail has the information or the knowledge, the healing power to help someone. And the knight, the seeker who goes after the Grail, is in a sense going into the spirit realms. When you look at the stories about those Grail seekers, they tend to be the same kind of experiences that shamans around the world talk about, meeting fabulous creatures, men and women who can do magic, talking animals.
There was one story in particular, the one about Sir Gawain, that you...
That's not a Grail story.
Oh, it's not a Grail story,
no.
okay.
So if you want to consider the Grail, you might, I mean, it's the same kind of theme, it's the same kind of situation that it's...
Wasn't Sir Gawain looking for the Grail?
In the story that we're talking about, he encounters the Green Knight, he and Arthur, and the knight challenges them to a riddle. Frequently, when the Green Knight appears, he gives a riddle, and Arthur and Gawain have a year and a day to answer the riddle, or the Green Knight will chop Arthur's head off.
Okay. What about the Green Men, and as much as the Green Knight has come up, is this something that goes back before the shamans or the Celts in the British Isles? This idea of the Green Man. I know I have this wonderful image in my mind of that monument, the giant, and it's all very green, and I know it's not exactly.
Well, the Green Man is the figure of the Green Man is a male face, and sometimes body, and instead of having hair and beard and mustache, the Green Man has vegetation, grass, vines, leaves. And what that is a human, when human beings create green men or sculpt them, paint them, basically what I think they're trying to do is to say that, there is some male spirit of wild vegetation, some male spirit of the forest, and the way we'd like to see him, or the way that he may appear to shamans in their altered state of consciousness when they're journeying into the spirit world, is this kind of a figure that is made up partly of bark and leaves and trees and limbs. And, is
he related to a particular, if we can go into the holidays, the 4 Celtic holidays, is he related to one more than the other?
Well, being the spirit of vegetation, he's around all year.
Okay.
But the thing about the Green Man being able to chop his head off and then walk off with it and come back in a year with it back on, is that this is what we see in nature. Nature can die every year in the fall, and then seem to be dead or dormant over the winter months. And then it all comes back to life again, like it is now, here in April and May. And then the Green Man, in a sense, grows in power and strength during the summer months, only to die again in the fall. So it's more a sense that he's around all year, but the times when he's the most active would be spring and summer, when things are just kind of wildly growing,
Right.
turning green.
Exactly, yeah. This idea of Robin Hood and Sherwood Forest and so on, we tend to think of that as being kind of green
Right.
as
Robin
well.
Hood is a kind of a green man. He's, and maybe in a sense, a kind of a shaman too. There's a similar figure in Ireland called Finn McCool, who is kind of the head of a, not necessarily an outlaw band as Robin Hood is in England, but he's the head of a band of men who live outside the law, who live in the woods and the forest. And one of the things about Finn, and it's also true of Robin Hood and some of the stories of Robin, is that they know magic, or they know magical means of disappearing into the woods and being on terms, intimate terms with the woods. And it's not just that they know where the trails are, they know the names of trees, but that they're at home with the spirits of the forest and the spirits of the woods. And that a lot of their adventures and a lot of the exploits that they get involved in are really stories about going into the other world, into the spirit world, like shamans do. And coming back with some kind of information or power or healing techniques.
Well, I think this relates quite strongly also to the idea of the environment today and how people, do you think there's a correlation that shamanism has become popular again because of, not because of, but in, which came first, but the environmental
Right.
idea?
I mean, it's I think one of the reasons that we're seeing such a renaissance or a resurgence of interest in shamanism and other, if you want to call it tribal religion, tribal spiritual practices, is that it is very earth-centered. I mean, it honors and respects the earth, and it looks at creation as having the spirit of the creator, that you almost can't separate them. Things are sacred. And one of the things that I personally think that the earth and human beings desperately need today is this sense of reverence and respect, that everything is alive and conscious and wants to communicate with us. And that includes the animals and the rivers, and air, plants, trees, rocks, all it is.
Okay, I think we're going to take a little break and we'll come back and continue this conversation with Tom Cowan. This is Mary Michele for WVIP, and I'm back with Tom Cowan, and we're discussing Celtic shamanism. In particular, I wanted to get around to this idea of the 4 Celtic holidays. The one in this country, of course, that people are the most aware of is Halloween or Samhain. I think we should talk generally. I wanted to zero in on the one in the summer particularly, but if we could talk just kind of generally about the 4.
Yeah, the 4 Celtic holidays of November 1st, February 1st, May 1st, and August 1st were important in the British Isles and particularly in Ireland because they were agricultural. There were agricultural things to do at those times of the year in terms of cows and sheep and calving and lambing and milking and even going to war. There were seasons for warfare back in ancient Ireland. And so those 4 days become like holidays and festival days that mark the different seasons. And in general, the Celts divided the year into a summer season and a winter season. The summer season going from May 1st to November 1st, and the winter season going from November 1st to May 1st. And then halfway through those 2 halves, the season changed and there were other activities that had to be done, and one was August 1st and one was February 1st. So in a sense, summer begins on May 1st, autumn begins on August 1st, the harvest season. Winter began November 1st, or the eve of November 1st, which is Halloween, and spring began around February 1st.
Is there something that correlates the? I know that the idea of Halloween or Samhain and Beltane, there's kind of something that we understand with the nature of death, dying, in between world kind of stuff, and Beltane, and rebirth in the spring, and let's go dance around the maypole. Is there something around those lines? Is there some kind of celebration that's done with Imbolc and Lughnasadh?
Yeah, the February 1st Imbolc was primarily a woman's feast, and the feast of lambing, and the ewes would be giving milk again. And this was right at the time of the year when the dairy supplies were giving out. The cows were not grazing and producing milk, so it was very important at that time to celebrate the return of the ewe's milk, particularly for babies who tended to be born and needing or weaning at that time. And it becomes the Feast of St. Bridget in Christian times, although Bridget is the name of an older Celtic goddess who was probably also a spirit involved with birthing, with milk, with fire, to keep people alive and warm at that time of the year. And then in the summer, the August 1st is the first harvest. So the Feast of Lughnasadh, honoring the sun god Lu, was a celebration of the beginning of the harvest. I mean, now is the time you start, even in our country, you start to see you pick 'em signs around August the 1st, and you're picking your own crops and apples and things.
Did they have fires at Lughnasadh? Was there bonfires? These huge.
Most of the Celtic holidays are fire festivals, yeah.
But there wasn't it was really more about, they weren't cooking anything. I mean, what was the fire representing?
Well, life and, the life force and the energy of, it keeps vegetation and people and animals alive.
Some of the other things that correlate to, there's a story about Lu, isn't there? And he was...
Well, Lu is the old Irish sun god, or one of them. And he was known as Lu of many skills, many crafts. And there's a story about him seeking entry as a young man to a court, and the gatekeeper asks him if he has any skills, and Lu says, well, I'm a carpenter, and the gatekeeper says, we have a carpenter, and Lu says, I'm a doctor, and he says, we have a doctor, and I'm a metal worker, and he goes through a number of human activities and sciences and arts, and the court has somebody that's proficient in all of those, and then Lu says, well, do you have anyone who is good at all of them? And the gatekeeper says, no, we don't have anybody who can do them all. So he's allowed in, has entry on those grounds. And what's, I think, fascinating about it is that as the sun god, the sun is the source of all our human activities. We wouldn't be able to be sitting here talking, or cameramen photographing us, or people out there turning on their TVs. There wouldn't be TVs if there wasn't sun. In a very real way, we are dependent on the rays of the sun and the life energy that comes from the sun. And so the Irish honored that on August the 1st by honoring Lu. And the festival there was really pretty much like a county fair. There were horse races and sporting activities, and people arranged marriages or began marriages at that time. Crops were being harvested, and people would show their crafts. So it was like a sort of a county fair. I like August 1st, the Feast of Lughnasadh, because it's kind of like the county fair in the Celtic year.
Yeah, well, I think in hearing you talk about it too, that there is this slight difference between Beltane and Samhain, in as much as Imbolc is the feminine and Lu is the masculine. So there is that makes it a little different than the other two. I wanted to talk a little bit about St. Patrick. And whatever his Celtic origins might have been, or how he...
Well, he was a Romanized Celt living somewhere on the western coast of England or Wales, and was kidnapped when he was 16 by Irish pirates and taken to Ireland, where he served as a slave for 6 years, herding sheep. And during that time, he had a spirit guide named Victor, that he called Victor, who encouraged him to escape, and he did. And then when he came back as a Christian missionary, he came back to convert the people that he had met and known there as a slave. He didn't bring Christianity to Ireland. It's one of the mysteries as to when the first Christians arrived in Ireland, but we know that they were there long before Patrick. But Patrick brought back kind of Romanized Christianity, representing the strain of Christianity that comes through Rome. The earliest Christians in Ireland were more from the desert tradition of monks, hermits, the monastic tradition, which appealed more to the Irish because they were living in villages and small clusters of families and clans.
Well, when you read the Roman accounts of the Celts, they try to lump them all together, but you can't really do that, can you? I mean, they're kind of very individualist, sort of.
Yeah, they're tribal people that at one time, back, let's just say 400 BC, were scattered all across Europe, from what's today Spain to what's today Turkey, and into the British Isles. So much like Native Americans, they're different people, different languages, different names for themselves, but they shared a certain common racial and spiritual culture.
I wanted to talk a little bit about skulls and how you often see in the Celtic art. Actually, I mean, you see it throughout history. In the Renaissance art, they show skulls a lot, or Hamlet is contemplating a skull. I mean, it's not sort of something that's just. But I think they probably got it from this idea of the Celts, and I think it sort of relates to your book a little bit, the fire in the head.
Well, the Celts believed that the soul resided in the head. So the skull then of somebody who has died becomes like a sacred relic, because this was the tabernacle of the soul when the person was alive. So the ancient Celts collected skulls, kept skulls, revered them as still sources of wisdom. Places where if you're going to talk with the spirit of the dead, you would most naturally want to talk through the skull. The same idea carries on into Christian times, where the skulls of saintly men and women were preserved at wells or at chapels, and people then became then objects of pilgrimage. People would go to them as a pilgrimage to ask advice or to seek divine favor.
I wanted to talk a little bit about the idea of the fool, the trickster. Is there any one particular character that is known for this in the Celtic lore?
No, in Celtic lore, in folklore, it tends to be simply the various spirits or fairies or pukas who play pranks and tricks and try to trip us up, make us think, who are we really? Are we really in control? Or is there something that is beyond us? It's very similar to Coyote and Raven in Native American lore, or Loki in German mythology.
So they embarrass you sometimes.
Right.
Make it a little difficult.
They take delight in pointing out our foibles and our faults.
What about the Grateful Dead? Do you think that they're modern shamans, the people that follow them? Is there some tradition there?
I wouldn't say that. I tend to be very narrow with my use of the term shaman. As a person who drums, rattles, chants, dances to create a dreamlike state of consciousness, very specifically to journey into the spirit world, to get advice, information, or healing from personal helping spirits. People that just hear voices, people who have visions, you might call these spontaneous shamanic experiences, but when you're talking about a shaman or a shamanic practitioner, you're talking about somebody who does this intentionally with practice and is very effective at it.
Yeah, there's a discipline to it.
It is a discipline, yeah.
But I think that the nature, it's interesting how the Grateful Dead has been the most popular band in the last 20 years. I mean, it also correlates to the idea of environmentalism and I'm not saying that they are, I realize that the tradition of a lot of the people that follow the dead are not necessarily disciplined, but nevertheless, it's speaking through them somehow to me. I don't know. I think it's funny, and they have a skull as their, that's what you see with them so often. Let's see, what else? Is there any way to describe the kind of visionary experience or the things that happen in between the worlds with this kind of experience?
Yeah, in general, people who practice core shamanism, what they learn and practice and, in a sense, get good at is a technique or a formula to leave, for your consciousness to leave this reality and move into the kind of reality that most people only encounter in dreams at night or when they read mythology. And that kind of dreamlike, mythical reality is real. It's a different reality. It's not ordinary reality. It's what Carlos Castaneda called non-ordinary reality. And there are very specific, safe, effective ways for shamans and practitioners of shamanism to enter that reality and then come back when they've done what they need to do there. And in general, a lot of people use some kind of an opening into the earth, like a cave or a spring. The Celts, for example, always favored springs, places where water comes up out of the earth as an entry into the spirit world.
I think water's a good image that we're going to have to end on. But I want to thank
okay.
you very much
Right.
for being with us today.
It's my pleasure.
This is Tom Cowan. I'm Michele for WVIP.